They're blaming the CPS largely, saying that this was a show trial. The media is blaming social media is blaming the media. I mean, at the end of the day, she was a very vulnerable woman who clearly wasn't getting the help that she needed.
And I know less of the detail than Ella, but I would find it difficult to rush to a conclusion about why somebody would encompass their own destruction. It seems to me that coming up with a singular explanation, whether the CPS or the social media or ITV or anything else, is way too reductionistic. I mean, these are often multifaceted, multifactorial issues, and I don't know her. I don't know if any of the people commenting know her particularly well, and I wouldn't rush to judgment on that. One thing that does strike me quite powerfully is that celebrity and fame and wealth definitely doesn't provide any immunity to mental health problems, to anxiety, to vulnerability. I come from a sporting background, spent most of my early journalistic career writing on sport. And there was a view 20 years ago that if you were a top footballer earning lots of money, then you weren't allowed to feel vulnerable. It wasn't acceptable to feel depressed, that this was some indication of weakness. And I remember Andrew Flintoff doing a documentary where he was very open about his depression. And it was a bit of a watershed moment where suddenly other top sports people started coming out and saying, I feel the same way too. I think we've moved a long way in our culture in that respect. But I would pick up on that other thing that you said, Ella, that the social media, whether it is implicated in what's happened in this tragic case, I don't know. But it's definitely it's added a toxicity to our public life.
Just before you come in, I just want to bring in, this is the front of the Sunday Express, a much nicer picture. Ella there, TV star Caroline dead at 40.
I mean, I said it was a complicated picture. The thing that also has to be noted is that Caroline Flack was working in an industry in which she was well aware was a very difficult one. She was open about her personal life on social media, especially on Instagram. She, as I said, was, I'm 28 and I'm intimidated by the contestants and how good looking they are on Love Island. She was a woman who was considerably older, but the pressures of that, having to go through that kind of media scrutiny, every single thing she wore, every time she walked on stage, every time she went on television, her whole outfit and appearance was unpicked in this kind of quite destructive manner. But that was the game she was in, and that was the game she was playing. And I think that it's fair to say that these celebrities, and certainly people around reality TV, understand the gamble when you go into that arena and you know that you're going to be criticised. Even if you look amazing, you know that you're going to be criticised. I'm not saying that excuses the harsh treatment of her, but it's this, if we're talking about how to move forward to prevent more cases like Caroline Flack or Sophie Graham or Mike Pelositis, who were the other two individuals who were contestants on Love Island who committed suicide, then you do have to accept that people go into this with a certain amount of understanding of what the toll might be taken on them. But should there be more done in terms of protecting individuals? And I do think that ITV has got some questions to answer with the support that they did not give.
Yeah, let's look at the front of the Sunday Telegraph as well. Tragic death of Caroline Flack, another photograph of her coming out of one of those early court hearings. I suppose it does ask the question about these programmes, reality TV programmes. And we've asked the question plenty of times in the past. 3 people now linked to this programme have taken their own lives. Love Island say that the 2 contestants, that happened a long time after they'd appeared on the show, and we have to be careful about drawing links. But at the same time, they do sort of attract people who perhaps are somewhat vulnerable and maybe can't quite cope with the pressure or aren't aware of the pressure that they're suddenly going to find themselves under.
Yeah, and I mean, Caroline Flack was a presenter rather than a contestant
for a long time
in this show. But I have to say, when I watch reality television, many aspects of reality television, I think they're incredibly manipulative, highly exploitative. Jeremy Kyle, for example, which got axed, the idea of bringing people on to a television program, was it live? A live television, or perhaps recorded
as live,
but recorded as live, and suddenly they would take a lie detector test on an issue of supreme emotional significance, and it would be a big reveal that would lead to animation and high levels of emotion and acute vulnerability. That seemed to me the most awful kind of bear baiting and to parade people who might be vulnerable, who might be hoping for a dose of celebrity as a part of mass entertainment. I don't know if Love Island was...
Love Island's a very different show.
It wasn't.
But at the beginning, as I understand it, it was highly produced to create these moments of great emotion and often aggression.
And it still is highly produced. I mean, I have been a long-term fan of Love Island and of Caroline Flack, as it happens, because it actually, and the interesting thing of the way that she and the producers worked with it was this trashy show, predominantly about sex, especially in the early years, much more so than today, and about good-looking young things, fighting with each other and getting off and doing all the things that, produce difficult emotional scenarios. But there was always a genuine, not to sound corny about it, but a genuine strain of love in it, and it was interesting in terms of the way that human beings interact. There was a huge amount to go there in terms of positives. What I wouldn't want to see is us to suddenly start moralising about reality TV and understand that Caroline Flack, as an individual case, has her own individual reasons, as much as Sophie Graham and Mike Talassisis had. But the question is, when someone needs support like this, and her particular case of being a woman of a certain age who was hounded for a certain reason, I think we need to look at the specifics.
We've got to go to the break. Just in 10 seconds, should the show carry on?
I think it'd be incredibly hard for either Laura Whitmore, who's the current host, or Ian Sterling, who does the voiceover, or any of the contestants to compassionately carry on. It was Caroline Flack's show.
And of course, you have to remember, of course, many of them will be very close to her and will have been friends with her. Hard for them to carry on making the show, let alone anything else. All right, thank you both very much indeed. Coming up, Boris Johnson changed his mind on the mansion tax. We'll find out why after the break. Go into the next budget, or so we thought.
Well, it was speculated on the front page of this newspaper last week, and we actually discussed it on this show and said that it would likely be shelved when there was a backlash from Conservative backbench MPs and grassroots, which is exactly what's happened. But of course, it's been a very interesting week politically, because the person who was due to be delivering the budget has resigned from the cabinet, Sajid Javid, and been replaced. And that, I think, leaves the new Chancellor, in some people's view, as a bit of a poodle. Number 10 will be running policy when it comes to the Treasury. I think that it's possible that the new Chancellor, whose name I'm struggling to remember,
Rishi Sunak,
has more power than people realise, because it will be extremely difficult for the Prime Minister to lose a second Chancellor. I understand he's a fiscal conservative, wants to balance the current budget over the course of the next Parliament. And you remember under Margaret Thatcher, Nigel Lawson resigned because of the clash over Alan Walters, her personal economic advisor. John Major came in, but was still committed to join the ERM. And Thatcher had to cave at that point. She didn't want to lose a second Chancellor of the Exchequer. So if he is canny, I think that he will be able to have some level of discretion, unless, and this is a big caveat, unless Johnson and Cummings decide, you know what, we can lose 2, 3, 4 chancellors. Donald Trump has sacked a whole litany of cabinet members, and it doesn't seem to have affected his support from his base.
Yeah, well, it all brings us on to Dominic Cummings, doesn't it? And this story in the Mail, big double-page spread. There's a picture of Boris Johnson there with a crown on his head. The Prime Minister accused of regal arrogance.
Well, yes, this is all about the role of Dominic Cummings. Must be the most influential political advisor of our lifetimes. My lifetime's slightly longer than yours, and you fit into that. But you think, Alistair Campbell and Jonathan Powell and Charles Pole and Bernard Ingham, nothing like this level of power. And the Conservative backbenchers are saying we can't have an absolute monarchy. There needs to be some checks and balances within the cabinet and beyond. And I think the role of Cummings, it's going to run and run, isn't it? His power.
I'm torn between, yes, the obvious evidence of Cummings being incredibly influential. And then on the other hand, we do live in a kind of political culture in which people are obsessed with the puppet masters and always looking for the shadowy figures behind the scenes, and there must be something going on here. And you forget what an operator Johnson is. And aside from Cummings, Johnson is somebody who's managed to manoeuvre himself into the greatest position of power in this country with the help of Cummings, but I would not say of just leaning on Cummings. And there's some interesting bits that the Mail picks out in terms of him purposefully banning Dominic from being in the room when he was doing the hiring and firing of the cabinet to try and symbolically signal his independence in a way. The interesting thing will be, and this links to the mansion tax question, we forget that there is a split in the Tory party, not as much as the Labour Party, but there is a significant split in terms of the newbies who understand that they have to play it more kind of to the centre crowd to get in the support of these new voters they've got. And then, as is mentioned here, that members of the 1922 committee, the classic Tories who say mansion tax, don't you dare, go after our wealth, don't you dare, and the kind of classic Tories, as it were, those two sides are going to keep clashing, and there's, certain of the rebel MPs, as they're called, are saying they're going to make their voices heard in Parliament.
Yeah.
Regardless of his 80-seat majority.
Majority, yeah, of course. We're going to have to leave it there because it's an important night with regard to the weather. We want to get the latest on that. But thank you both very much. See you again in half an hour. So, okay, here's the weather. She struggled with mum guilt. And I'm joined by Ella and Matthew. A very sad evening this evening. Hearing this news around 6 o'clock that the TV presenter Caroline Flack had taken her own life. Let's take a look first at the front of the Sunday Times. Love Island star Caroline Flack dies at 40. A very nice picture there of Caroline. Tragic news. And I think Matthew put it quite nicely on social media a little earlier. We have to be careful, don't we, not to rush into trying to work out the reasons behind this. I think tonight we have to just accept that it is desperately sad.
Yes, and there's a huge amount of hot takes flying around on social media and people trying to pin the blame for her tragic death on either one cause or another. And obviously the point is that suicide is an incredibly complicated thing that more often than not does not have one cause. And it must be so horrendously painful for her family and friends, not only losing her, but having her death plastered all over the papers and people speculating on why it was that she decided to take that tragic and final step. The story in the Times is different to the other coverage in the newspapers because this focuses on the fact of the case that was ongoing with Caroline, and it picks out the fact that her management team, some of her close friends have said that this was a show trial. And what they mean was there was obviously the alleged assault between her and her boyfriend, and that night, that very complicated night of which we don't know the full details. Even though her partner said that he didn't want to press charges and he expressed a huge amount of love for her, actually on Valentine's night posted pictures of love for her, the case was taken forward. She was prevented, her bail conditions stopped her from being able to contact him during the holiday period or at any time. She came out around Christmas and actually posted a thing on social media saying, I have my story to tell, and this is a complicated picture, and thank you for those people who are supporting me. And the question is really, that moving forward, do we express and believe in forgiveness? And do we have an understanding of innocent until proven guilty? And do we want to give people the benefit of the doubt and understand that Caroline was someone in a particularly tumultuous situation with her mental health and with the fact that she wasn't getting a huge amount of support from her employer and ITV, and her whole private life was plastered all over the papers. I think part of the nastiness with the way that she was treated and the way that her case was taken as a kind of a political symbol for many people. See, women are abusers. See, it was inflated out of her own personal experience, and she was sort of she was used and abused by the press and by social media users as something, not an individual, but something that was symbolic of something else.
Yeah, let's move on and have a look at the Sunday Mirror. Their headline, Love Island, Caroline dies in Valentine tragedy. Matthew, I'll get your thoughts on that in a moment. We have just heard from the boyfriend of Laura Whitmore, who replaced Caroline as the presenter of Love Island. He's also the voice of Love Island, Ian Sterling. He has tweeted in the last few moments saying, today my friend slow motion walked into heaven. I will miss her always. Thank you for everything. A tweet from Ian Sterling in the last few moments. There is an issue here, isn't there, Matthew, that the media likes to blame social media for this sort of thing. People on social media like to blame the media, the tabloid press, whoever it may be. At the end of the day, probably we're all a little bit to blame when something tragic like this happens. A lot of people saying on Twitter and the like tonight, be kinder. And social media is so toxic, isn't it? And the papers can be accused of being toxic as well. I just wonder will we learn anything from this?
Well, I think one thing, amplifying what Ella said, that I found the rush to judgment not just premature, but profoundly insensitive. It's a CPS, or it's ITV, or it's this person tweeting on social media. Suicide, encompassing one's own destruction, is almost always complicated, multiple factors. I think we should just take a step back and recognise that a family is grieving and her friends are grieving. But on the broader point that you make about the toxicity of social media, I think that is unquestionably an issue, not just in public life, but in the private lives of people who aren't famous. Being able to, in real life, you might have one or two people who insult you or who say something negative, and that's always difficult. Obviously, all of us are sensitive to some degree. What strikes me about social media is if a group of people start to bully you or pile in and you become the epicenter of a storm, you can be reading 5, 10, 20, 30 negative comments one after the other. And, I'm not at all famous, but once or twice, I've got into the middle of one of these storms, and you think you're just going to take a step back and say, these 30 people who are being nasty about you, it's like 0.001 of 1% of the population. Why does it matter? But when you're reading them one after the other, I think it does make a big impact on you. And I worry about young people who are not famous who are seeing this, but it must be even more difficult for somebody in the spotlight who might be on the negative end of a, what do you call it,
Pylon.
Of a pylon.
Yeah, we just had the front page of The Sun come into us. We can take a look at that as well. Caroline dead at 40, Love Isle star, suicide tragedy, dies day after new court. Shock is their headline. There's also hypocrisy, isn't there, as well? People who perhaps were rude about her in the past on social media, in the papers, whatever it may be. Now, of course, mourning as well. People need to take a look at themselves.
Yeah, The Sun particularly has come in for some criticism on social media, but other papers as well, about the fact that, throughout her career, especially on Love Island, she was routinely scrutinised and criticised as when she had a series of dates with men who were younger than her. She was criticised as being a cougar. Anytime she looked like she was having...
That's business, isn't it?
Exactly. Anytime she looked like she was having any kind of fun, she was told that she was doing something wrong. Either her dress was too short or something was going on. She was drinking too much. There was so much scrutiny for this woman, particularly because she was in Love Island as a show which is about hot young things, and there's a huge amount of narcissism around it, and it is a relatively toxic environment. But for a long time she weathered that quite well, and she was, I genuinely think she was a role model for some young women, as someone who was going to have a good time and believe in herself and be strong, even inundated with criticism. But obviously we don't know what was going on in her head, and she was incredibly unwell at points and unhappy, and unfortunately that's what's happens now.
Can I make one point on hypocrisy? I think being kind is obviously a good thing to do, but one thing that strikes me is the lack of self-awareness of those people on Twitter who will often project themselves as kind people for a gentler, more humane world, and when somebody disagrees with them politically, my goodness, they can be vile and personal and ad hominem. And you were talking, we came on at 10:30 to talk about this story, and you made some really cogent points about the importance of kindness. And some other people started piling in on you. Yeah. It's just incredible. The fact, I think as a medium, because you're not face-to-face with someone, it's like when you're in a car and you make an obscene gesture at somebody you're not going to see again. On Twitter, I think that's a lot easier. But it's remarkable how many people think that they are kind on Twitter and call other people out who are horrible and nasty a lot of the time.
Yeah, let's just take a look at the front of the Telegraph as well. A lot of editors having to change their front pages, obviously, after this story broke at around 6 o'clock this evening. Not a particularly flattering photo there, sadly, of Caroline leaving one of the court hearings.
Yeah, it's the last picture of her in public, and she's obviously in a deeply troubled place there. It's a much nicer picture on the front of the Times, showing when she was happier and healthier, and who she really was. And there's the thing to note is that as much as there's people doing negative hot takes online, there's a huge amount of love outpouring for her from her friends and her colleagues who talk about the times in her life and her career in which she was the real Caroline Flack, someone who was, in a good place and enjoyed life, and actually through her work changed the lives of others. So we shouldn't forget that side of it as well.
Should the show continue, do you think?
I think that wouldn't want to rush to moralising about Love Island, particularly Ian Sterling, as we've just heard, is a very good friend of hers, so is Laura Whitmore. The idea that that show can continue, it was Caroline Flack's show.
Yeah.
It was her show. That can continue, it seems to me a strange and difficult situation.
Yeah, we haven't heard yet from ITV. No doubt we will in coming hours. Thank you both very much indeed for the moment. Coming up after the break, Boris Johnson changed his mind on mansion tax. We'll find out why after the break. In terms of Storm Dennis, but let's just talk, Ella, very quickly about this story in the Mail on Sunday. It relates a little bit, I guess, to what we were talking about earlier, about what you can and can't and shouldn't say on Twitter.
This is the story of Harry Miller, who retweeted what was meant to be a limerick or a lyric from a feminist song that was critical or taking the mick out of trans. And the whole debate about that. He was, a police officer turned up at his place of work and then investigated him. And the headline that everyone's running with, and the quote is that the police said to him, "I need to check your thinking." And there's a broader question of, A, should the police be worrying about people's tweets? Should they be turning up at people's work about tweets? And this was described as a non-crime hate incident. This is whenever I talk on programs like this about the censorship and the dangers of clamping down on free speech, it's things like this that matter. Having coppers turn up at your work because of something that you retweeted.
Matthew?
Well, I think there's a huge overreaction from the police. I think their defence, they say that these kinds of what was the terminology? Non-hate crime incident. They sometimes act as precursors for genuine hate crimes, and therefore they like to track them. But going to somebody's place of work is an overreaction. And the judge put it well. He said we mustn't move into an Orwellian society.
Yeah, and of course he won his case, didn't he?
He won his case.
Thank you both very much indeed. Great to see you. Have a good Sunday.